Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the National Arts Club at Home program. My name is Ben Hartley. I'm the Executive Director at the National Arts Club, and I'm thrilled today to have over 400 people from around the world joining us on this very special program. It's a special program co-presented with the Hermitage Museum Foundation and the Observer. For those of you who don't know, the National Arts Club is a 501c3, a non-profit, and when we're open, we're on Gramercy Park, leafy Gramercy Park in downtown Manhattan. We do over 150 free programs a year. 40,000 people come and enjoy our programs. You know, in our current world, there are many things that are challenging and hard. So it's especially noted and something we need to all observe is the small successes we have. One of these small successes is this program today. This program happened because Sarana Beal-Cohen, the executive director of the Hermitage Museum Foundation, joined a number of arts leaders nearly a year ago for lunch at the National Arts Club, where we bring together arts leaders from all over the country or all over the city to talk about exactly this, collaboration. So I really want to thank Sarana and her team at the Hermitage Museum Foundation. I also want to thank Michael Rose and all the team over at the Observer. They are our media partner here, and they've helped us get this to an even broader audience. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to the brilliant curator, author, and professor of art history, Joachim Pissarro. He's joined by one of the most insightful cultural critics and journalists that I know, and certainly of our time, David Darcy. You can read David many places, but obviously in the Observer as well. David, Joachim, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. And I guess the only thing better than the National Arts Club at home is the National Arts Club. We'll get there eventually. So I'm coming to you from my own little Hermitage in Alpine, New Jersey. Force majeure, as they say. It's a huge, huge topic, talking about Catherine the Great and Denis Diderot. So let me just give you, and especially if you've been watching the TV series, let me add a bit of correction to the mythologies about Catherine the Great and the mythologies about Denis Diderot. This will be very, very brief. Catherine was born in Germany, in a town that's now in Poland. Her original name was Sophia Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Domburg. You can see why one reason why she wanted to change it. She went to Russia at the age of 14 in the hope of the empress at the time, Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, that she would be a proper wife for Peter the Great's grandson. It turned into an odd marriage, and odd is an understatement. By the time Elizabeth, the empress, died, Catherine was planning her own uprising, which took place a year or two later. So she was a usurper to the Russian throne. And she is also largely thought of as having helped organize the murder of her husband, which gave her free ride to become empress. If she didn't organize it, she certainly tolerated it. 2 years later, she started buying art. First bought the collection of Frederick II in Berlin. People go to Berlin and say, why didn't they have a better art collection in Berlin at an earlier time? Well, because it was sold to Catherine the Great. Then Catherine hired a man named Denis Diderot, a very well-known writer, philosopher, controversial man in France, and she began buying collections very, very effectively. So soon she became the most important art collector in Europe. In 1773, Diderot, whom she admired, was brought to Russia as an advisor, and we'll get a little bit more about that. Most of the art that she had bought with Diderot's assistance was bought by then, but she'd continue buying. Let me talk a little bit about Denis Diderot, one of my favorite writers, born in 1713, died in 1784. A man of controversy because he seemed to refute most prevailing theories about religion and about politics. Started out his career publishing things anonymously. One of the things that you may not know about Diderot is that he published a book called Les Bijoux Indiscrets, the indiscreet jewels, which, without describing it any more graphically, is, if not an inspiration, an antecedent to Eve Ensler's The Vagina Monologues. I'll leave it there. Also wrote a number of other books, The Nun, La Religieuse, which was finally published in 1780 after he returned from the Hermitage. Jacques le Fataliste, Jacques the Fatalist, Rameau's nephew. I should just tell you, we're talking about a man of the 18th century, of the Enlightenment, to give you an idea of how modern Diderot was, or how modern he was considered. In 1967, when The Nun had premiered at the Cannes Film Festival and was going to premiere commercially in Paris, the government shut the film down. Why? Because it showed a woman who was forced into a convent, who was forced by people who were working for her parents or for her mother. And eventually, after she refused to be confined, after she'd escaped, she was put into prostitution. The church didn't want to see that. The funny thing was, at the exact same time that The Nun was banned, The Screens by Jean Genet, which is far more subversive play, was allowed to run because the French government didn't want to ban two works by major authors at the same time. But let's go back to the 18th century, and I'll give you Joachim Pissarro, who is a professor of art history at CUNY, Hunter College, and who can tell you a lot more. Joachim.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you very much for this great and very informative introduction. So yes, a lot of what you say is absolutely correct, David. And indeed, we know a lot about Catherine the Great. We know a lot about Diderot. We know less about the relationship they had together, even though there was a book published only a couple of years ago on that very subject. And Nadine, if you don't mind, perhaps we could look at the first slide to get an idea of what this topic will be about. Can we get full screen or? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So here you see the two of them. What you have to understand is that in the mid-late 18th century, the time leading to the two major revolutions, 1776 in this country, the United States, and 1789 in France, two revolutions that each in its own context, historical and juridical context, brings down to an end the rules of a monarchy, the rules of monarchy over the colonies in this country, the rules of absolute monarchy in France. And all this had to do, or was at least very, very amply nurtured by the activities of the likes of Diderot, whom you see here to the left, greeting Her Majesty Catherine the Great, or people like Voltaire, his colleagues, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and many others. What one doesn't quite measure today is that those guys were far more than philosophers today. I mean, who knows a single philosopher in one's surrounding, you know? And these guys were the superstars of their epoch, of their moment, of the society. Everybody was talking about them. Everybody was jealous to have them in their salons, and they were hit upon by the monarchs themselves. To give you another example, Catherine the Great was by far not the only one. She, in fact, was competing with Wilhelm II from Prussia in Berlin, who himself had secured the presence of Voltaire, who was kind of his conseiller, his advisor, his intellectual entertainer, is a term I kind of liked, you know, to have, you know, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have television, we didn't have social media or anything like that at that particular point. So entertainment was really derived out of the exchanges with such celebrities as the Diderots, the Voltaires, the Montesquieus of this world. So how did the beginning of the relationship between Catherine the Great and Diderot is an interesting one. Diderot was monetarily not secure at all. He needed to bring up enough money for his daughter who was getting married. If you didn't have enough money for your daughter's wedding, this was a serious social penalty, and he was in debt himself. And Catherine the Great couldn't have she knew that, was informed by her ambassadors, her envoys in Europe and Western Europe, and she knew that this was the kind of Achilles heel of Diderot. So, but she knew that if she said, well, I will offer you X, equivalent of millions and millions of dollars or rubles today, she would have offended him. So what she offered was to buy his library for an absolutely astronomical sum, which of course she could afford, but she was a very interesting, it shows you already the kind of political intelligence of Catherine the Great. But she also knew that without his books, Diderot was nothing in effect. So she says, I will buy you this colossal library. It will come to the Hermitage, but you keep the books as long as you are alive. Phenomenal, kind of astute gesture on her part. And so finally, she manages to bring him around. After such a largesse, after such a huge, generous gesture, Diderot, at least morally speaking, was in her debt. And so she brings him in, making sure that in a way, she's going to be an equal to Frederick II in Berlin, who has Voltaire near him, also knowing that Diderot, who's a celebrity everywhere in Europe, not just in France, Catherine the Great, and her peer, Louis XV in France, are not in best terms at all. For various reasons, details I'm not going to get into, but basically she's very happy to steal such a celebrity away from the Parisian salons of the Parisian court. Now you need to understand that Diderot himself is absolutely not a courtier. He is not someone who goes to the court, who is entertained by high aristocrats, goes in the vicinity. First of all, he was in prison, sent in prison by Louis XV himself. So he's really on the margin, on the edge in the French society. So he's not unhappy to leave France, but at the same time, when he arrives in St. Petersburg, he has, to say the least, very little decorum. And in fact, this little print gives you a sense. You see how he's kind of puffed up and putting himself in front of, this kind of arrogant, kind of macho-esque situation, which is almost grotesque. So let's move on to the next slide, if you don't mind, Nadine.
Can I just add something here for a moment?
As you wish.
In that last picture, Diderot is wearing a colored jacket. He met with Catherine wearing black. He wearing the clothes of a philosophe, of a philosopher, and that's all he wore when he met Catherine. And the other thing, looking at that picture, it looks as if those two figures are more or less of the same age. Catherine looks she looks imperious as she could be, but she looks quite a bit older. She was 16 years younger than Diderot. And she...
So if you don't mind, David, I'm just because some of what you're saying is segueing with what I'm about to say. So why don't I just get quickly through my presentation, and then you can come in and say, throw in, because I think otherwise listeners will be perhaps a bit confused. So I was actually going to talk about that degree of equality that is a very strange situation. And as you heard, in fact, David described absolutely correct, Catherine the Great is not born to become anything like a monarch, period. Certainly not the monarch of Russia. She's German, she's from, yes, an aristocratic family, but she's a fairly simple, rural, aristocratic girl. And it's absolutely extraordinary that she ends up marrying Peter III, a weak, also German, by the way, that's how they became introduced to begin with, a weak emperor, very pro-German, which was, of course, super unpopular in the court of St. Petersburg. And his wife very, very quickly understood this and used this towards her own power very, very successfully. So I love this particular image where you see her kind of looking almost like a man herself. And, you know, she is, when you saw that first print, she is treating Diderot from a kind of on an equal basis. It's a really interesting thing. She sort of lowers herself, and you will see what that means. And he kind of sort of somehow is tries to elevate himself to her level, and they kind of have this kind of tug of war situation, this frenemy situation, friendly rivalry. So we see her here in her travel costume. Let's move on, Nadine, if you don't mind. So here is a very interesting image. That's before the couple before he became the Tsar of Russia. And you see how, in contrast, here she's this meek, fragile, sweet, pretty, very pretty little girl. And they already have the little boy who will become Paul I. But you can definitely say that in this particular picture, she is nowhere close to one of the major absolute monarchs of the world, and as she became. Let's keep going. And I want to point out this picture is by a woman, Anna Rosina, by the way. And so she goes from that to one. She is looking at what? She's looking at Rome. She's looking at the imperial culture of Caesar Augustus. She's looking at the culture of coronation that bring not kings like her rival in Germany, Wilhelm II, but emperors who are above kings. And she really takes this momentum as a destiny. She really turns it into her own idea in a way. And so she creates this extraordinary situation that you're going to see. I mean, we could have done a whole exhibition on the coronation of Catherine the Great. You can keep going, Nadine, and all the kind of accoutrement, details, situation that symbolize her importance as a sovereign. Here's another one. We can look at the crown here. So notice as well this very fascinating quote here. Decency requires that affluence and magnificence should surround the throne, and for all of which expense money is not only necessary, but highly useful. That's part of her legal code, so the so-called instructions that, in fact, Diderot will have something to do with. So let's keep going. Next. So that's a reconstruction, that's a model of the famous crown, which became a kind of effigy, you could say her synecdoche. Yes, that's I mean, this is a fascinating, we won't go into this because the social, political history of Europe, of the world, in fact, at the time is fascinating. These are the representatives of the Ottoman Empire, the longest ruling power over 1,000 years throughout Asia and Eastern Europe, who are now bowing to Her Majesty the Empress in the Winter Palace. Let's keep going. I'm just giving those to you as a way to get a feel for, let's keep going. And here she represents herself not so much as an historical figure. So both of these situations, no, we went too far now, but it's okay. Actually, if we can just stay here. In this particular image, she is not looking at herself. You see, the crown is gone. She is not so much an empress as a goddess. She's the representation or the embodiment of the goddess Minerva. Minerva, who was the the Roman goddess of justice. And so she, in a very interesting kind of almost contradictory move, goes back to the antiquity in order to incarnate some of the obsessions of some of the very preponderant concerns of what the late 18th century is about, couched by the famous, French motto, equality, fraternity, liberty. And so she is here looking at justice. She wants to equilibrium will be for her people, and that will be a big topic of conversation between her and Diderot. So let's keep going. Can we keep going? Okay, so this is, of course, another major part of her personality. She moves into the small Hermitage, transforms it very quickly. The slide has moved, so we'll keep going with the slide. What I want to immediately point out to you is the fact that Catherine the Great is known, often referred to, and I think without too much hyperbole, without too much excess, as the greatest collector of all times. And I think she probably is that. One could certainly think about Napoleon the first in a similar bracket, but she basically acquired what she bought, what she gathered, whereas, as we know, Napoleon just went and took what he gathered. So this is very different. And what the way she was going, and we can keep going, so she would not so much collect one object after another, as we know collectors do today, and have always done, but she would collect collections, and she would buy the collections of von Bruges, she would buy the collections of the first prime minister, Walpole, the first prime minister of England, etc. So let's now see what else she was collecting. She was a big thinker herself, and a writer. She had a phenomenal knowledge of contemporary philosophy, as I have done. I mean, she was not just bringing Diderot to her court, who, by the way, had absolute free entry, free access to Her Majesty every day of the week from 3 to 5 p.m. Unprecedented, unparalleled. So it shows you the kind of rapport they had. But she was also really a stupendous reader and thinker. And this very first text, the so-called nakaz, which is the kind of code, similar document of the code civil, the code of his own empire. So she wrote her own code. And interestingly enough, according to some political scientists, she simply sometimes quotes, knowingly or not, certain paragraphs, certain sentences from Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, which he had read and learned by heart, and so was recitating in some way. So this relationship between philosophy and her was a very essential part of how she shaped her vision of her own empire, which it was a complete sea change with the past. So let's keep going. So that is definitely the kind of material that she and Diderot would have looked at on a daily basis through their discussions. Let's keep going. That's another. You see, the text is written in French and German, which is interesting. No Russian, Russian being the language of the people. It was not deemed to be necessary. Let's keep going. Next, thank you. I love that that print is a sort of black and white illustration of what you saw before. I just love this dialogue, which I translated in Infuriated, that were really on a kind of equal. No, can we go back? 1 second. I don't know. Is this on an automatic? No. Okay. I guess there's a problem here. But all right. Well, Nadine, can you stop the looming thing, because it keeps going. Can we go back 1 second? I don't know if Nadine can hear me. We'll see if this keeps going. Then thank you. So I just want you to see this quick sort of impromptu language, sort of a fight. They're having a fight, and the Empress Catherine says, "Stop! We're getting heated up here. You keep interrupting me. I interrupt you. I'm being impertinent." And I love her reply. What? There's no impertinence among men. So when I was telling you about the very first image, that sort of sense of equality, she is a man, and he is there really. When he comes to her salon in the court of St. Petersburg, there's no more majesty and there's no more philosopher Diderot. They're kind of laying off their guards and their honors and are just down to earth as two individuals, as two men, as she puts it. So let's go on to the next slide, which is a slide of an extraordinary work, well, that painting. So this is the rival of Diderot, Voltaire, who, as I mentioned before, was hired in a way by William II in Berlin. He tried to invite Diderot to come and see his boss, William II. And for some extraordinary reason, Diderot, was he told by Catherine the Great? We don't know exactly, but bypassed Berlin, and which infuriated no end Voltaire and of course, William II, who was being snubbed. Let's look at the next slide, which is one of the great works in the Hermitage. It is Jean-Antoine Houdon's sculpture of Voltaire as an aged man. And here, Voltaire sort of knows, I mean, it sort of confesses that he has been superseded by Diderot. And he says, I'm positively in disgrace at your court. Your Imperial Majesty has tilted me for Diderot or for Grimm. So he's kind of playing the jealous game. I'm being wounded. You prefer Diderot over me, that sort of thing. We don't have time to stop and look at the relationship between Diderot and Voltaire. It's a complex one, but this just to give you a sense of the overall intellectual context that was going on in Europe at the time. Let's next, if you don't mind, Nadine. Thank you. So what I'm now interested in telling you about, because this is, we are looking at the Hermitage, and sure, ideas are extremely important. I personally come from a philosophy background. I would not 1 second disagree with that. But what is interesting in the case of Diderot, and if in his relationship, very complex, multifarious relationship with Catherine the Great, is that he is not just a man of the pen, an homme de plume, as you see him in this portrait by Van Loo. He's also an art dealer. He is the one who is literally telling Catherine the Great to buy certain, not only certain works, because as I told you before, she doesn't buy works of art, she buys collections of works of art. She buys the whole thing. And he is the intermediary, you would say today, the art broker or the art runner, if you will. And he establishes relationships with the owners, signs the deals, sends the money, gets a commission on the way, as he should do, and basically is acting as a commercial representative of the crown. That's not something that I've seen mentioned in most books, either about Diderot nor about Catherine the Great. And it's a role that I think kind of deserves maybe more attention. So let's keep going, if you don't mind, because that is a very unusual situation. And I love the fact that you have this double portrait here. Here again, she being incarnate, dressed, donning the clothes of Minerva, but burning incense or sacrifices at the altar in front of the effigy of the goddess herself, and a portrait of Diderot done about 10 years apart. Diderot just after he had more or less left St. Petersburg, and by the same artist, Dmitry Levitsky, this Russian portrait artist. So let's keep going. Their relationship gets much more interesting and rich as we go. In fact, the relationship over him taking over and becoming her kind of ambassador, her kind of art broker worldwide, starts with her looking for the best possible artist. So she's looking for, let's say, the Picasso of the 18th century to represent a major monumental sculpture of Peter the Great, whose grandson she had married. But she absolutely had a devoted admiration for Peter the Great and saw herself as his legacy, as trying to promote, to continue to further everything that Peter the Great had established. And Diderot wrote an incendiarily dithyrambic eulogy about Falconet. Now today, unless you are an expert, or unless you're an art historian focusing on the 18th century, I doubt very much that you would have heard about Falconet. He is well known in the 18th century circles, but not otherwise. And so Diderot, again, establishes a relationship with Falconet, and eventually Falconet moves to Russia and spent something like 20 or 30 years, I forget exactly, but he became a very important part of the Russian society. And here is his commission by Catherine the Great. You see her name mentioned under Pietro. So the two Peter the Great, Caterina Secunda, are like almost, you can barely tell who is who on that particular sculpture, which is interesting. So let's keep moving, because that's just the sort of the case number 0, you might say. I mean, he's just introducing her to. So here he is himself. And what I find interesting is that they both have in common, Catherine the Great and Diderot, the fact that they are like chameleons. They change their faces, their features modify themselves as almost as often as they wish. And so you see him here without any wigs, a sort of very natural kind of way. No makeup, because men wore makeup, nothing, just almost naked, by Houdon, who is the same sculptor who did the great monumental sculpture of Voltaire. Let's keep going, Nadine, if you don't mind. And so here's another one of his numerous sculptures, portraits. This particular portrait, again, many women artists in the 18th century with whom we're not we're not crediting enough. This is in fact a person who was a pupil of Falconet, the sculptor for Peter the Great, and her stepdaughter, his stepdaughter, sorry. So let's keep going, Nadine. Greuze, very important figure. So he is represented here in a very also simple, down-to-earth kind of way. Let's keep going. This became a print, which we're going to see next. And let's keep going. So, to have a print done, by the way. So here's a one of the most important paintings, I think, Greuze ever painted. And here again, Diderot is absolutely instrumental in bringing this hair-raisingly moving, powerful painting by Greuze, the paralytic, Filial Piety, 1763. Don't forget, she becomes an empress in 1762, so she's barely been a year on her throne, and she begins buying things like this. I mean, it's a very, very big sign. So let's continue. Nadine? There's a problem with yeah. So what I find fascinating with Catherine the Great, okay, we're going too far now suddenly, but she not only buys, as I said, these collections of collections. So here, in fact, by mistake, we are finding ourselves in front of a cover of the catalogue of Crozier's collection, which I wanted to focus on. But if we were to go back to the slide, which I wanted to comment on, we see that she does not only buy major paintings, but she buys tons of drawings. And the Cabinet des Dessins, the drawing collection in the Hermitage, is what it is. She buys, I think, something like 10,000 drawings. It's not, a small number. She buys entire collections of prints as well, lithographs, woodcuts, and so on. So that, to me, is an indubitable sign that she is herself a very passionate collector, and that she doesn't, you've read all kinds of possible scenarios, interpretations about why she did this, as wanting to up the upmanship with Louis XV, William II, Carl Gustav II from Sweden, etc., etc. Yes, no question, there was an element of that, but she would need no drawings to play that upmanship game, and she does that with an extraordinary eye, with an extraordinary dedication, and that to me means that she is truly one of the great, great collectors we've known. So now we can move to the cover, thank you so much, of the famous Crozier collection. the descendants of which, the Baron de Thiers, whose descendant himself will become the Prime Minister of France a century later, so the Baron de Thiers and his sisters had sold essentially the collection en bloc to Catherine the Great in 1772 via the intermediation of Diderot, which until recently I myself did not know that. It's absolutely fascinating, and you know, this is not why one is talking usually about Diderot and Catherine the Great. So that's what I would like to look at with you. So let's look at some of the impact, visual impact, some of the contents of what Diderot, mandated by Catherine the Great, brought to Russia. Can we see the next slide? Thank you. So, I love this. I mean, you know, these sale catalogs at the time, there was no website, of course, there was no internet, there was no photography, right? So what did we need? You had these very interesting, astute, super fast artists such as Saint-Aubin who would literally copy in a miniature version. So these are the photography, these are the Sotheby's and Christie's catalogs of the time. I find this absolutely fascinating. So that is on this base that Catherine the Great bought the Crozier collection. You know, she couldn't have bought, I mean, you know, shipped en masse hundreds and hundreds of paintings and drawings and works, decorative works. So she trusted Diderot, and she had people like Saint-Aubin sketch what those works were like. A fascinating, different culture to what we know today. Let's, next, please, Nadine. Thank you. So let's now look, I'm not going to spend much time on this. You're going to recognize some of your favorites, I'm assuming, at the Hermitage Museum. All this comes from the famous Crozier collection. Crozier was one of the wealthiest men probably in Europe in the first half of the 17th century, and underwent some sort of bankruptcy at the end of his life, and the descendants basically had to sell the collection. So we have this very famous portrait of a young woman by Titian. Let's keep going. I just want to give you a sense of the I mean, no words, Danae's, Titian's Danae. Let's keep going. And Rembrandt Danae, which an unbelievable painting by Watteau. One of my favorite Chardin paintings, The Laundress, which was incredible modernity. So can we go back? Go back. So I'm giving you a tip of the iceberg. Okay, this is, I'm not even doing justice to the Crozier collection, which anybody who has done a little bit of history of collecting knows that this is one of the major names. And she, as I said before, had already bought, before she started looking at the Crozier collection, several other collections. So that by the end of her reign, so she becomes an empress in 1762. I believe she dies, I forget the exact, 1792, or so, a few years after the revolution. Within 30 years, she has amassed a collection that is absolutely unequaled. You have to look back to Louis XIV, perhaps in France, to find maybe an equivalent. But again, Louis XIV, I don't think was a collector at heart. She was. She has amassed a collection of 4,000 or 5,000 paintings. To give you a sense of measure, today the collection of the Hermitage is about 25,000 paintings, I believe, and the Louvre is about the same. These are the two largest collections. So within 30 years, we're now 300 years away from the beginning of the foundation of the Hermitage. Within 30 years, she has created the 25% of the entire collection of paintings of the Hermitage. And as I said, she adds to this, I mean, tens of thousands of works on paper. I'm not even beginning to do justice to her interest in decorative arts and commissioning living artists, etc., etc. She was absolutely enamored, passionately enamored, obsessed by French contemporary art, meaning mid-late 18th century art. And I think to a certain degree, actually, I would maintain this is my hypothesis, that she you know, probably, almost certainly, influenced what was going on in France in the late years of Louis XV and Louis XVI, just leading to the French Revolution. So she was really a phenomenal force of power. And so all this dialogue, we don't have much time to go into greater depth, but I would invite you to look back at this book I was mentioning about, and I know David has done a lot of homework as well, and probably has lots of things to say. I think all of this leads us to sort of think more openly and more, I would say, with more curiosity and maybe kindness as well towards Catherine the Great, who's not always depicted very kindly, for sure. I mean, she was not a saint, you know, then definitely, but there's some really fascinating aspects to her personality. So here we are. So I just wanted to close, and I was wondering what we can go to the next now, the next two slides. What would be the equivalent today? And I found another Catherine, who's not often mentioned, Catherine Dreyer. Can we go to the next one? Catherine Dreyer, here she is, who also amassed, like, had this kind of collectomania. You know, she bought hundreds, thousands of works of art, and she had, as an art broker, Marcel Duchamp. And I find this, you know, and let's see her at home with Duchamp, who looks like a little boy compared to her. There's the next and final slide. That's in her home in Connecticut. And eventually the whole collection went to Yale, except the big glass that you see behind Duchamp's back, which is now in Philadelphia, one of his most major works. So that would be perhaps a sort of small equivalent, but this nonetheless remains a pretty exceptional story.